Today we are going to be taking a look at Six's story, Trudge in the Long Night. Now, this story is a bit of an interplay between two kind of opposing lines of thought. You have this first idea that fate is immutable and unavoidable, and that no matter what you do, you will inevitably reach this kind of predestined endpoint, right? And this is an idea that is quite heavily present in classical Greek mythology. And then you also have this idea that the story itself brings up, that fate is something that you need to forge with your own hands, and that complacency will eventually cause you to miss out on the things that you were meant for if you kind of just like sit back and let things happen to you. Or in other words, that fate is something that needs to be worked towards. And these two contradictory themes kind of weave together to form the crux of Six's conflict throughout the story. And that is what we're going to be going over today, so let's go ahead and get to it. A voice came from above and spoke to the man. An important thing will happen to you. What will it be? The man asked. You will gain wealth. You will gain fame. You will walk in the garden of wisdom and happiness. And thus, until he died, he spent his life waiting for his fortune, yet it never arrived. When the man lay sick in bed, he cried up to the voice from above, asking, "When will all that you have promised finally arrive?" The voice scorned him, saying, "It has already come and gone, only you never sought it out. Because you thought you knew your fate, you took no action. In the end, you achieved nothing." A Trudge in the Long Night begins with these lines. They are the words of an apparent fable, the voice from above, and we first hear them through 210, who is orating to an auditorium of people. In this first scene, we are introduced to our usual appearing crew, 210, 37, Sophia, and 6, who still goes by his birth name, Attakus, as we find out that the soul number 6 is an inherited number reserved for the island's leaders, those of Attakus's bloodline. However, we find out that it's not just his form of address that is different. The Attakus of the past is wildly dissimilar from the 6 that we know in the present. He is far more timid and reserved, and when he is confronted by 210 for a debate, he almost immediately concedes, retreating to sort of avoid the conflict. And it's also here that we first learn of this idea of the revelation, which is a blessing that would grant all the knowledge of the world to each generation 6 upon inheriting their soul number and becoming the leader of Apiron. And this is something that Attakus himself will have to undergo eventually, and it almost seems as if this is something that he is not too terribly happy about at the current time. However, we are not yet given indication as to why. And it's at this point that we shift to Sophia, where she meets Attakus on the beach. When asked why she is there, we find out that her father's eyesight has been failing as of late, and that she is here to collect sand so that she can polish a new set of glasses for him. When Sophia returns the question, she guesses that Attakus is here because of his previous clash with 210, but Attakus kind of denies this idea, right? He says that he knew his actions would cause 210 to get riled up, but this was more due to just a sort of incompatibility in their natures, and that 210 is just too competitive. And that he doesn't really want to debate with 210, as he kind of sees it as purposeless. And he kind of has this same opinion for most other people, it seems, claiming that any debate would just be sort of pointless, and that each side would only ever really cling to their own opinions, and that any contrasting views would just strengthen their stance, and that since the outcome is inevitable, any actions for him to take, for him to involve himself, would just be futile ultimately. Attakus then shifts the topic towards Sophia's father, saying that she must surely know that his condition is basically irreversible at this point, and that anything that she does isn't likely to hold any meaningful impact on his ailment, right? And he kind of wonders why she bothers going through all of her actions despite this. Once again, he kind of brings up this idea of a futile struggle, of going against fate, that what she is doing doesn't really make a ton of sense because she can't stop it. And to this, Sophia responds that she doesn't actually know, right? Just that she knows that she has to do something. That even with effort, even if she were to put as much effort as she could into it, you can't really avoid the inevitable, but that doesn't mean that you should just sit around and do nothing about it. That surely if something has to pass, they can still sort of take actions to prepare for it or limit the impact of it. Make do with what you can. She gives this analogy of a glass bottle that is atop a table and destined to fall. Even if she can't prevent the bottle itself from falling, she can still lay out a cloth so that cleaning up the shards is at least a little bit easier. And Sophia kind of realizes that these aren't the answers that Atticus is looking for, right? That his worries and his contemplations lie elsewhere, and she correctly guesses that it's something to do with the revelation. She asks him if he fears it, to which he responds with a rage and an intensity that she hadn't actually ever heard from him before. And it becomes kind of clear that Atticus resents the revelation. He likens it to some manner of dictate from heaven that doesn't really care for the wants or the wills of those beneath it. And he questions if something like that, something that would just trample over other people, it could really even be considered a blessing at all. And it's at this point that they part, but not before Atticus tells her that he thinks her thoughts are right, that you gotta do something even if it seems inevitable. And Sophia notes that after this moment, Atticus went into a long retreat and was only ever seen rarely by his peers. We shift again, this time to the point of view of 210, where he and 37 are going to meet with the current 6, Atticus's aunt. And it's here that we learn that the lifespan of a 6 is quite short. Atticus's mother had passed when he was still a child, and now his aunt, who had been her successor, is in an irreversible state of decline. Upon reaching 6's abode, they find that she is trying to converse with Atticus, though he does not really seem to reciprocate. If anything, he seems to act kind of coldly towards her, brushing her off before leaving, and this kind of rubs 210 the wrong way, right? This disregard, he says, is the greatest disrespect and insult, a taste like bad wine. And we come to realize that 210 greatly respects the current 6 and finds Atticus lacking in comparison, which is kind of the root of his really aggressive and competitive nature towards him. He goes to confront Atticus, talking about what a great blessing that he is fated to have, and expresses anger with how blasé Atticus is being with it, saying that he's unworthy of the revelation and that he lacks the qualities of a good leader. And it's here that we get a bit more information on the nature of the revelation. 210 says, "The amalgamation of knowledge and wisdom of every 6 since the inception of Apiron will, without any arduous drilling, enter your mind the moment you receive your number. You will make a great leap." Atticus then asks if 210 truly believes that the revelation is a blessing, and then rebukes this by saying that it is nothing of the sort, and in fact it's the exact opposite. It's a curse. However, Atticus does concede that 210 is correct about the current 6, that she is a complete number, that she is a perfect person, an outstanding leader. However, he ends this kind of ominously by saying that all 6s are like that. They've always been like that. And this kind of gives us our first real hint towards the true nature of Atticus's resentment towards the revelation. The next 2 scenes take place in Atticus's place of retreat, where 37 goes to bring him food and finds him amidst a mountain of books. She takes this opportunity to seek his counsel, recounting a minor conflict that she's had with another Apiron follower, 26. And it's a bit of a minor thing, something about recording all proofs, even the ones that wind up being false, and 37 doesn't believe that they should be recorded just because proofs' values are in their correctness or something. It's not too terribly important, I think. And she asks for Atticus's opinion on the matter, to which he claims that he doesn't actually have an answer. 37 asks if, after reading all of these books, he'll have the answer, to which, again, he states that he does not know. However, this time he echoes Sophia's words from before, that it is better to try something than to do nothing at all. 37 finds his demeanor kind of odd, and asks if all of this studying is part of some proof, to which Atticus states that he is simply contemplating the nature of 6, conceding that this might indeed be a proof regarding his own nature. Now, the next visitor to his retreat is 210, and it seems at this point that a bit of a time skip has occurred, as both Atticus and 210 are now both in their adult models. Puberty really hit that man like a truck, I tell you what. A ship is also mentioned, which Sophia's father and the current six are supposed to be boarding, and this likely places this particular conversation just prior to the 1987 storm, when a ship of Apuranites had been reversed. 210 asks if Atticus will see the ship on its voyage, to which Atticus reminds him that he is still in retreat. As usual, this makes 210 very mad, and he reiterates that Atticus never really seems willing to fulfill his duties, and that the brilliance of another six just makes him seem so dull in comparison. Atticus then says that 210's vitriol isn't really fueled by rationality, but that he's letting his emotion get to him. His respect for the current six, whom he calls by name, Alma, has blinded him, and that 6 is just a number, and that people place far too much significance upon it, which kind of echoes 37's whole view on the significance of numbers. Of course, this just makes 210 even angrier, and he asks what manner of study that has arrested Atticus's attention to such a degree, and he finds out that it's just the old Apiron fable, the voice from above. And this is kind of the icing on the cake for 210's rage. Like, the man's had it at this point. He's just done, right? He says that the curse of becoming a 6 has driven Atticus mad, leading him to squander his destined wisdom and his talents. And despite this, he laments the fact that regardless, Atticus is still going to receive the revelation. He's still going to become 6. He's still going to become leader, and all the wisdom that is tied to it, which kind of calls back again to this idea of inevitability, of this idea that no matter what happens, no matter what actions are taken, you can't change what's coming. 210 then goes on to state that Atticus is going to be the reason that Apiron stagnates, that his leadership is what will lead the island to its doom, basically. To which Atticus does rebuke him. He asks if progress is something to be pursued, even if it means inevitable destruction. And it's a bit of an odd question to ask, right? It doesn't really make sense in terms of what we know right now. However, we do get a bit more context and a bit more details later on, which does kind of reframe this question more in a way that makes more sense. Immediately after 210 storms out, Atticus rests, ruminating on Pythagoras's golden verses, which prompts a bit of a flashback back to when his mother was still the reigning 6. Here we meet a version of the current 6, Alma, who is presented as a very, very different person from the upright and the competent leader that has been described so far. The Alma that we see is caring but lackadaisical. She prefers to laze around and to nap in the shade rather than pursue any of the typical Apiron pastimes, math and logic and all that other nerd stuff. Atticus kind of also knows that she's not particularly good at dealing with children. He asks her about the golden verses, to which she kind of waves it away, saying that children shouldn't really be thinking too heavily about thoughts of fate, and that he should set the verses aside and just enjoy the present a little bit more. And to this end, she sends him out to play. Atticus stays out until evening, gets in a bit of a scuffle with some small critters, and upon returning finds Alma acting a little bit odd. She appears to be in some sort of fugue state, not really responding when he calls out to her, only snapping out of it after several moments. And she sees his disheveled state and kind of fusses over him before quoting the golden verses herself. Pray to the gods for what you are about to do. Pray that all goes well. Atticus finds this odd, and recognizing something is weird, asks, who are you? But before she can answer, they are both interrupted by another Apiron believer who rushes over, telling them to hurry up or else it'll be too late. However, Alma stops him. She says it's already too late, right? She has received the revelation, and it's at this point that we recognize that Atticus's mother has already passed. And it's at this point that Atticus recognizes that Alma has basically become the archetypical 6. She has become this perfect person who has wisdom and balance and vision and is just perfect in every way. And as he puts it, Alma became 6 that day, but 6 was not Alma, not any longer. And this is basically the crux of Atticus's whole conflict, right? This idea that one day he too will have to eventually come to terms with the revelation that it will come upon him as well, and just like Alma, he will be crushed beneath it. And knowing this, some things from before start to make some sense. You know, this idea that 210 kept bringing up about Atticus not really living up to the vision of what a 6 should be, the fact that he never really seems to care to fulfill his duties. It's almost as if Atticus has been fleeing from this responsibility. In a way, it's like he's trying to reject the fate that he's been kind of thrust into in what few ways he's able to. His line about progress despite destruction wasn't necessarily a reference to the future of Piron, but to himself, because for him to embrace progress, for him to embrace the role of the 6 that he must become, is to embrace the fact that he has to eventually, you know, become something else, to destroy himself, right? However, he recognizes that fate is inevitable. He can't defy it, it's going to come, and so he instead chooses to blind himself to it. He closes his eyes and he covers his ears, and he decides that he would just rather not look back and see if that bottle is about to tip over from the table, right? And that's basically just how he's carried on right up until he has his conversation with Sophia. And so, recognizing his fate, Atticus begins to distance himself from his friends so that when he does become like Alma, he won't be missed. He likens it to a boulder from atop the mountain coming down to crush him, which kind of invokes this idea of Sisyphus, you know, a man who is sentenced to struggle in futility to perform an impossible task, an outcome that is already decided, right? Every time he pushes that boulder up the mountain, it'll just roll back down again, yet he must still perform his penance, right? We find Atticus walking along the beach having a bit of like an internal conflict within himself, where he's trying to attempt to reconcile his doubts, but his psyche rebukes him. It tells him that he shouldn't doubt, that fate can't be defied. He says that he doesn't wish to accept fate, only for his psyche to claim that fate doesn't care, it's going to happen regardless. And to this, Atticus grows frustrated. He asks if this is just something that he has to tolerate, if the only thing he can really do is wait and be transformed into something else entirely. He questions his purpose, if he's only meant to be a vessel until his appointed time comes, to which his psyche just responds, I don't know. And following this self-reflection, we return to a familiar point, where we are shown the meeting of Sophia and Atticus on the beach, but this time from Atticus's point of view. She's collecting sand for her father's glasses, and he asks her why. Why does she try to defy fate? And we find out that he never really intended to get an answer for this, right? This was just something he was asking because it was something completely alien to him. He couldn't understand why someone would try to go against something that's already been basically written in stone, right? So he doesn't expect an answer, but the answer that she does give is something he completely doesn't expect. That one just has to do all that they can to prepare and to plan for the inevitable. And this is kind of the turning point. This is the turning point for Atticus. This is where he recognizes that there are still things he can do even if he can't prevent the thing that's going to happen from happening. And it's from this point on that Atticus goes into his retreat specifically to prepare for his prophesied fate. He understands the futility of it, but chooses to do so anyway, saying that if the bottle must fall anyways, he might as well fill it with as many pebbles as possible, so that maybe it's a little bit harder to tip over. And we kind of realize what it is he's trying to do. He's basically trying to fill his own vessel with knowledge in order to lessen the impact when the revelation does hit him. And it's at this point that we get a little bit of recontextualization. We are shown scenes that we've already encountered, however this time it is from Atticus's perspective now that he's attained his new view on life and on fate. The first scene that we see is the one in which 210 and 37 are going to see Alma, only to find her conversing with Atticus. And we find out that she was just expressing concern over his sudden frenzy of studying. However, rather than disregard or coldness as 210 had initially led us to believe, what we find out is that Atticus simply understands. He recognizes that Alma is just acting as a 6 should. And he's even able to, through all of his studies, guess her words. He recognizes that these are the things that a 6 should say. This is the way that a 6 should act. And when he is eventually confronted by 210, he immediately understands the character of the man, of someone who meddles in affairs that are far beyond his ken. And he compares 210 to Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, only to plummet into the sea when the heat melted his wings. Next, we're shown 37's visit, and here we find out that Atticus had already known the answer to her question, but chose to withhold it. He recognized her weaknesses, but also recognized that revealing them too early may do more harm than good, so he left her to basically figure it out for herself. And he likens her to Achilles, who was peerless in every way save for the weakness on his heel. As for himself, Atticus likens himself to Oedipus, the quintessential Greek tragedy, basically. The story of a man who, in trying to defy his fate, wound up fulfilling it with his own two hands. And through all of this, we kind of see that Atticus has begun to understand. He sees the people around him and he recognizes their needs and their flaws, and although the revelation hasn't fallen upon him yet, he has already gone and attained the wisdom for himself. In a way, he has gone and fulfilled his own prophecy. And in the final chapter of the story, Atticus has one last internal confrontation. He says that he has done all that he can to prepare for his fate, that he isn't the man in the fable, that he didn't just sit idly by and let fate come to him, and that he no longer needs this old picture book just because he has overcome it, essentially, that he has understood it. To which his psyche kind of counters him. He says, maybe Atticus never truly understood the fable to begin with. And this leaves Atticus a little bit confused, right? As it's a pretty straightforward story, but his psyche says that something within there Atticus has misunderstood, that just like the waiter in the fable, he had thought he understood his fate, but he couldn't have been more wrong about it. And at this point, Atticus is left to his contemplations. We zoom out and we see that he is now on the beach after the ship has departed. He looks out, he sees the horizon in the distance, he sees the sea, and he feels the water washing upon his feet, and he has his own sort of small epiphany at this moment. He says, knowing is not understanding, seeing is not experiencing. Nothing I thought I knew was more real than the cold water lapping at my toes. And after this, we get a little bit of a small time skip. The ship that had set out on the voyage prior has now returned, and in the very last moments, just as it's about to approach the shore, we see that the storm is hit and the ship becomes consumed. Sensing this, Atticus picks up his picture book, which we find out had been given to him by Alma before she departed, and opens it up and begins to read.
A voice from the above spoke to a man. An important thing will happen to you. What will it be? The man asked. You will gain wealth. You will gain fame. You will walk in the garden of wisdom and happiness. The voice answered.
The syndrome of the 1987 storm wound up turning people into geometric shapes, and as the first shape washes up on the shore of the beach, we see that the revelation has now fallen upon Atticus and that a new Six has been born. But Atticus still remains. And we end the story with his final lines, "It is just as simple as it is." And we see now throughout the story that these two completely seemingly contradictory ideas, the idea that fate is immutable, that it's unchanging, and the idea that fate is something to be worked towards, have been kind of woven together, right? At first, Atticus recognizes the futility of his actions, that anything he does is kind of useless, but then he buckles down and takes it upon himself to prepare, and in doing so, he enacts this prophecy himself through his own actions. And even if he hadn't, the revelation definitely would have fallen upon him, as it had with every other Six before, right? But maybe his case would have been closer to Alma's, whose whole demeanor wound up shifting in an instant. Earlier, we got a line from Six that compares 210 and 37 to adventurers building ships and sailing undaunted into the sea, while he thinks of himself more as the reef that just sits there and waits for the day that fate would come and knock him over. And at the end of the story, we get this line where he says, "The reef remains unchanged. It has been hardened by the erosive force during the long night. Now, I'm not sure if the prophecy was ever really going to change him, right? Because it seems rather ambiguous. The mention of the reef implies that it's only through his own diligence and work that he was able to avoid becoming transformed. But with his final lines, it is as simple as it is. That seems to imply more of the opposite, right? It seems to suggest that he had just fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the revelation, and it simply was just a revelation. All it did was grant him the knowledge. But either way, I don't really think it matters, right? Because it was this idea that it would change him, this fear that he would cease to be, that drove him to prepare and to put in the effort and to evolve, basically. He is Oedipus, right? He is the man who charges headlong into a fate that he cannot escape. Except this time, Oedipus kind of knows and understands that rather than trying to defy fate, he ought to simply try and work with it to the best of his ability. And, you know, through his own will and his own actions, Six lays down the foundation and puts forth the work, and he eventually becomes the Six that he was inevitably going to become through his own efforts. So that was quite a lot, wasn't it? Yeah. Final thoughts. I think I really enjoyed this story. This is probably my favorite out of all of the character stories and all of the anecdotes so far. Just everything about it, man. The whole setup for the story, the whole payoff, the character arc, you know, Six's whole journey from becoming someone who was trying to run away to someone who kind of buckles down and, you know, takes responsibility for his future. I think all of that was just fantastically done. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for the video, I think. It was, I mean, this was a longer video. It was a very dense story, just in terms of both, you know, like the length and also like the subject matter, right? The themes were kind of existential, kind of heavy. But yeah, that's the video. If you have stuck around this long, I greatly appreciate it. I do hope you enjoyed. But that's gonna be it. I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.